May 18th is the anniversary of the Gwangju Uprising, when the citizens of Gwangju launched an armed uprising against South Korea's military regime. To give you a brief overview for our listeners, on October 26, 1979, South Korea's longtime military dictator Chung Hee was assassinated by his own head of secret police, ending the infamous Yushin regime. However, in December of that year, General Chun Do Hwan, chief of South Korea's internal security, seized power in his own coup d'etat. On May 15th of the next year, students in Seoul organized mass demonstrations demanding an end to martial law, which had been declared after Park's assassination. Chun Do responded by expanding martial law to the whole nation, including the island of Jejudo. Student leaders decided to end the protests in order to discuss their next moves. Protests stopped everywhere except for one city, Gwangju, the regional capital of the backwater Jeolla region. Jejudo was home to the political base of the junta's most famous political dissident, Kim Dae-jung. In response and retribution, the military elite who descended from the neighboring Gyeongsang region intentionally underdeveloped the Jeolla region during South Korea's rapid modernization in the late 60s to 70s. To give you an understanding of the level of poverty and discrimination the junta inflicted on the Jeolla region, the average wage of Gwangju workers was 47% lower than the national average. On May 18th, around 100 students faced off soldiers at the gates of Cheonnam University. The military, led by Vietnam War-hardened paratroopers, responded brutally. Soldiers would beat, club, and even bayonet protesters. One paratrooper was reported to have pulled out a knife and yelled, "This is the knife I used to cut the breast of 40 VC women." The scene was quite horrific. Citizens would carry carts filled with bodies of demonstrators who were murdered by the military to the protests. The soldiers' brutality outraged the community, escalating the protests first from the hundreds, then to thousands, and eventually to 100,000 by May 20th. By that point, ordinary citizens such as housewives, shopkeepers, factory workers, and the unemployed outnumbered students. And one of the most iconic moments of the uprising, hundreds of taxis descended onto Provincial Square to protest martial law. However, on May 21st at 1 p.m., the Korean national anthem was played from the rooftops of Provincial Hall. At that signal, the paratroopers opened fire. South Korean soldiers gunning down unarmed protesters, young students, workers, mothers would become one of the most infamous moments in Korea's post-war history. However, what really anchored Gwangju as a focal point in South Korea's history was that the locals fought back. Outraged by the massacre, protesters raided local armories and drove the paratroopers out of the city. The protests at that point had officially escalated to an armed revolt. Protesters who took taken up arms, mostly working-class youths, formed militias that were popularly known as the Citizens' Army. For 5 days, Gwangju was a city liberated from martial law, and what was truly a transformative experience. Even though there was large numbers of men carrying weapons, there was no looting or major crimes. Hospitals were flooded with people offering to share blood, including sex workers who demanded to be allowed to help. Housewives and volunteers created shared kitchens, serving free meals to hundreds of protesters. The humble rice ball would end up becoming an iconic symbol of the uprising. Some have even referred to this experience as the Gwangju Commune. However, the sense of solidarity was soon followed by political differences between the protesters. A citizens' committee was established by city leaders such as politicians, religious leaders, and anti-Japanese activists from the colonial era to negotiate with the military. A second committee was organized by students to manage the daily affairs of the city, such as funerals, food, and transportation. Both committees were dominated by moderates who wanted to negotiate a surrender that would lead to as few deaths as possible. However, radicals led by Yoon Sang-won, a local labor organizer and eventually the most important leader in the uprising, was opposed to any surrender to the military, which he feared would prevent the uprising from invigorating the battered democracy movement. Yoon Sang-won's group organized an underground newspaper called the Fighters Bulletin, and most importantly, they organized daily democracy rallies. Hundreds of thousands of citizens descended on Provincial Square, which was renamed Democracy Square, where ordinary citizens would speak their mind, practicing a form of direct democracy. Yoon Sang-won would use these rallies to build popular support for his faction's ideas and eventually take over both committees. However, by May 27th, the army had re-entered the city. The Citizens' Army had gathered in Provincial Hall to prepare for a last stand. The rebels had decided that they would fight to the death with the hope it would push Koreans to resist the junta. An orphan shoeshine boy who had died defending the YMCA wrote before his death, "If you want our blood, my lord, I will dedicate this small body of mine to you." Lord, what am I? I am a feeble being, a man trapped in a miserable existence. Lord, I have tried to live without shame or guilt. Please pour more pain, more agony, and more hardship on me, to give me the power and wisdom to overcome this world. The people spit upon us orphans, the scum of the earth. My brothers, my young brothers, is there nothing I can do for them? Will they live and die as trash, ever more burdened after my death? Lord, what should I do? What is conscience? Why do you put me under such a heavy yoke? Must I beg you for the strength to survive? Then I will do it, Lord. Help me and forgive us all in your name and mercy and love for the world. By 5:22 a.m., the military had killed or captured all the rebels in the city. Among the dead was Yun Sang-won, who had chosen not to flee. The government aggressively attempted to cover up the uprising, falsely labeling it a riot engineered by Kim Dae-jung. However, the Gwangju Uprising would end up becoming a turning point for the democracy movement, or as the popular saying goes, all roads lead to Gwangju. The Gwangju people's refusal to surrender in the face of brutal suppression by the military radicalized students towards Marxist and anti-American ideologies. Most critically, the fact that most of the rebels who died on the last day were working-class youths brought a wave of guilt to the student protesters who felt they had to abandon the struggle. Gwangju became a popular rallying cry for the democracy movement, which would eventually culminate in the 1987 June Revolution, when the junta conceded to the movement's demand for democratic elections. Hello, this is Red Star Over Asia. We cover Asian politics through a socialist perspective. My name is Jay, and with us is Mike.
Hello.
Bori.
Hello.
And our guest, Gapsu.
Hi, how are you?
Gapsu, can you actually tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, my name is Gapsu. I was born and raised in Korea. I came to state a long time ago, studied at New School. The reason I got invitation today here is that 20 years ago, I translate a book about Guangzhou called Guangzhou Diary. And I follow up about the Guangzhou after translation book, and I dig up some classified CIA document made some years ago, prove that there's no North Korean intervention in Guangzhou whatsoever. And the CIA knew all of that. So, which is why I came here, and I want to talk about the Gwangju Uprising and its aftermath. I'm very excited with this opportunity, and thank you very much for having me today.
Of course. So, if just for some background for our readers, the Guangzhou Diary is a collection of accounts on the Gwangju Uprising, authored by Lee Jae-wi, who was at the uprising when it happened. He was a student at Cheonnam National University, and it's considered the most important primary document on the uprising. Would you say that's a fair kind of explanation about the diary?
Yes.
All right, awesome. Well, so May 18th is the anniversary of the Gwangju Uprising. In 1980, the citizens of Gwangju, the regional capital of the Jeolla region, organized an armed uprising against the military regime after paratroopers opened fire on unarmed protesters. For 5 days, Gwangju was a liberated city in what some call the Gwangju Commune. Now, the Gwangju Uprising is pretty special to me. My family is actually from the Jeolla region. My uncle was actually in Gwangju when the uprising started. Fortunately, he managed to escape the city and ended up walking several hours back to my mom's town because my grandpa, understandably, didn't want to lose his only son. So I read in Kim Dong-chu's book, The Unending War, that the region Gwangju is in, the Jeolla region under the Park regime, was treated almost like an internal colony. One of the notable quotes from the Gwangju Diary was when a resident cried out, "Even the Japanese didn't treat us like this." I wanted to ask if you can maybe elaborate on the relationship between Gwangju and South Korea's modernization that happened under the Park regime.
Actually, Jeollado or Gwangju is the granary of South Korea, where most rice is produced. It's a very rich province, But however, I think inequality is endemic to the region. Landlord in that region very rich, very well-to-do, while the farmer and the peasant are very poor. And that was true during the colonial era. And there's actually inequality centrally endemic to the region for a while. But that inequality take a new stage under Park's rule because Park Chung-hee, the general who seized the power in 1961 and went to rule the country for 18 years until 79, was from the Gyeongsang province, that's rival to Honam or Jeonnam. He created a strong constituency in his home province by filling his cabinet with the Gyeongsang local and by invest heavily in his province. Park was favored conglomerate that are not from Jeolla, such as Samsung and Hyundai. Samsung's founder, Lee Byung-chul, was from Gyeongsang province, and Hyundai founder Jung Ju-young is from what now is North Korea. The regional bias was acrimonious. For instance, Samsung hadn't hired Jeolla College graduate until the mid-90s. In the 1980s, Samsung launched a small assembly line in Guangzhou area, probably to benefit from cheap labor pool there. The company named that subsidiary Guangzhou Electric. And that company was the only subsidiary of Samsung that does not include Samsung in their name. In the 1990s, Samsung renamed that the Guangzhou Electric Samsung Guangzhou Electrics because now Kim Dae-jung, who is the Jeolla native, became a president. Anyway, by the late 70s, Gyeongsang-do, the rival province, had the POSCO steel mill, Hyundai automobile assembly line, and shipyard, AG chemical plant, while in Gwangju, the two major factories at that time was Asia Motors and the Yushin Garment. Both are built in during the colonial era to support the Japanese war efforts there. There are only 6 factories. They hire more than 1,000 workers in Gwangju. The city's average wage was about 50% the national average. And about 2/3 of the city workers are what we should now call precarious. But Gwangju is still the education and logistics center of the province. There are more colleges than high school in the city. About 20% of entire population is students. By the time Gwangju Uprising took place, city was packed with the young men and women who are upset and frustrated with the political system that sidelined them for many generations. The aftermath of the uprising, the regional bias become more serious. And my father, for instance, is a self-made publisher, but he did not hire any single Jeolla native. I still remember him dumping a bunch of resume into the trash bin, naming the name, say, Jeolla bastard. And even at school, some teacher often preach the regional bias. And I was educated to be biased against Jeolla, indoctrination. Before I read the Guangzhou Diary as a high school student, I was very biased against, I myself against bias against Jeolla. But as you getting to know about the uprising, why people took up against their own government was my one anecdote to the regional bias.
Yeah, thank you for that. What I'm actually curious about is, so you mentioned that Park Chung Hee was from the Gyeongsang region. And so what I was told growing up was the reason why Park Chung Hee discriminated against the Jeolla region was because of rivalry that went back to Shilla and Baekje, which were two kingdoms in Korean history. Shilla was seen as the Gyeongsang-do area, and Jeolla was seen Baekje was seen in the Jeolla area. But I was wondering, how true is that sort of story? Was there sort of other factors in play?
I think it's ridiculous because obviously regional bias was spammed by Park Chung-hee during his presidential campaign in 1971 when Kim Dae-jung, his rival from Honam or Jeolla, come to challenging his rule and very close to win the election back then. So it was a byproduct, kind of artificial product of Park Chung-hee's rule. It has nothing to do with the two rival kingdom. People's memory span is no more than 100 years, and the two kingdom was there in Korea like 5,000 years ago. So they try to use that rivalry or backjeolla dynamic to justify regional bias. But this is not about regional rivalry, because obviously Gyeongsang discriminate against Honam or Jeolla. I mean, when you look at the racism in U.S., we don't say as rivalry between white and minority. White elite oppress minority. That's not rivalry. That's discrimination. That's institutionalized bias. There's nothing to do rivalry. That's a major. Actually, rivalry is a major narrative, especially among mainstream media. That's false and overstated. For instance, Gyeongsang Jeollado military did not kill Gyeongsang workers. It was a South Korean army killed their own people in southern area and decided to disfranchise them and discriminate against them. You should understand as some sort of capitalist bias rather than legacy of feudalism, which we don't remember at all.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting with the regional rivalry question, because you can like read like older Korean historical texts and like, you know, way before 1980 or so, before the Park Chung-hee period, where there was this like sort of active marginalization of Jeolla province. You can still see references to like people will refer as Jejudo as this sort of like restive peasant area where it's like, some kingdom will try to expand into that area, 200-300 years ago. And they're like, oh, fuck around and find out. So like, yeah, Jejudo did have this like history before 20th century of being sort of a rebellious area from what I've read.
Actually, it has nothing to do with regional rivalry because it's not Jeollado versus Gyeongsangdo. It's Jeollado against the rest of the country. My father from Chungcheong, middle province, but he has a strong bias against Jeolla people too. And at school, I still remember this Korean teacher, Aho, I can name him, Kim Young-guk. He asked each question what province their parents come from. And then he went on teaching about how bad is Jeolla is, how low-ripe people living in Jeolla area and going on and on. He's not from Gyeongsang, he's from Chungcheong. So regional bias against Jeolla is more like I would comparable to racism in US. You discriminate against one region totally based on where they came from, just like skin of color, based on their accent, sometimes based on their physics, or sometimes based on what they eat. Right, there are many nasty jokes about the 홍어회, right? Because it tastes good, but it smells terrible. So this is a form of racism. But Kim Dong-chun may be right when he say Jeolla was inner colony of South Korea. Exactly right. And Bruce Cummings, who a very famous historian teaching at University of Chicago, once told me that Kim Dae-jung is a great statesman because he unified South Korea finally by becoming a president from Honam, the Jeolla province. When Kim Dae-jung became a president, the impact of that presidency is more like impact of Obama's presidency. Afro-American become a president. So Kim Dae-jung, such a minority province in that country, become a president against regional bias. So I'm always opposed to see what happened in Guangzhou in terms of regionalism. It's obviously a form of discrimination. It's not French versus UK rivalry, or it's not US versus Japan rivalry. It's more like, it's a form of racism.
Oh yeah, just that 홍어회 is a fermented skate.
Yeah.
So because of all the ammonia within it, it gives out a very particular taste. Lots of people aren't able to eat it because of that, because it's so strong, and because it's a regional delicacy of the Jeolla province. There's lots of really discrimination based upon that, or at least there were. I think it's more I think the regional kind of discrimination, it's less explicit now. It might be instituted in how Seoul gobbles up every single other region in the country.
There is a joke. The rule now is in Gwangju versus Daegu. The rule now is everyone outside of Seoul hates everyone in Seoul. And everyone in Seoul hates everyone outside of Seoul.
I think obviously it's less visible regional bias today, but it's endemic to Korean culture, Korean modern politics.
That's
Yes,
true.
kind of the rest of the country against Seoul.
Especially among conservative circle, I mean, they still have harbor strong hate against the Jeolla. There's very strong distrust about what they do from Jeolla people, and in the past few years we saw systematic growth of facts about Gwangju Uprising. That's all done by far right and Gyeongsang natives. But again, this is not about regional rivalry. It's about discrimination based on region. That's racism.
Oh yeah, I agree with that. What you said about that actually reminds me what you said about the role of like the kind of comparison between Kim Dae-jung's presidency and Obama's was so my family in the Jejudo area, like I don't want to say they worship Kim Dae-jung, but it kind of borderlines that. There's this kind of belief that you say like there's three presidents you can never criticize. It's our job to protect them. It's Kim Dae-jung, Roh Moo-hyun, and Moon Jae-in. It's that there's this kind of, I don't know how to describe it, but it's almost seen as like we have to defend them out of just this hatred for the Conservative Party. Is almost like, it's because there's blood history behind it, right?
And I think Roh Moo-hyun, maybe people should know, Roh Moo-hyun is like a former human rights lawyer who became president 15 years ago now. But he reached out to the Jeolla region because himself is a minority in Busan. He never been to college. He somehow passed the bar exam and become a lawyer. And because he did not go to college, especially major one, Seoul대, Yonsei대, Goryeo-dae, he was marginalized in official politics. So that's the one of the reason he had to reach out to Jeolla region, where he believed he can build up the support. And with the Jeolla vote, he became a president, and many Jeolla people consider him as their one hometown boy rather than a lawyer from Busan. Roh Moo-hyun became a president thanks to the united front he built between the political minority like himself and the regional minority like Jeolla.
So when we talk about the spontaneous element of the uprising, this tends to overshadow that there were actual organizers and groups that played critical roles in sustaining the protests. One of the most notable among them was the martyr Yoon Sang-won. Yeah, at the time of the uprising, he was the Gwangju organizer for the National Democratic Workers' League, Jeonmin-Noryeon. What were the politics in the democracy movement in Gwangju and the Jeolla province overall? What was this National Democratic Workers' League?
Actually, Yoon Sang-won is the key leader of the uprising. I think he was the only person who who figure out things strategically over the course of 10 years. But to me, what made him stand out was that his political orientation toward working class. He was not Marxist, or he was not socialist. Obviously, he read Maurice Daw or Baron Switch. I'm not sure actually that make him a Marxist or not, but many people say, his former comrades say he was not Marxist or socialist. I believe them. As you mentioned, he was very smart enough to land a job in Seoul at a bank, but he abandoned that career to organize work in his hometown. But back then, South Korean left or South Korean progress do not think working class in separation from rest of the people. Working class it's a minju. It's a part of people in their mind or in their narrative. But Yoon Sang-won somehow separate working class from rest of the people and try to organize them. If he wasn't a Marxist, I can see that because I saw his writing, I saw many testimony about him, but obviously he believed that democracy without labor is not a democracy. And that without workers' participation, he believed that South Korea cannot have a democracy. That's the very primary step to become a far left. But he wasn't a far left. And Lee Chang-bok, the leader of the National Democratic League you mentioned, he has a strong working class orientation. I mean, what did he in 1990, over the course of 1980 and 1990 was he published a kind of a Korean version of a labor note, 매일 노동신문, in which he reports about strike, dispute, labor law change, this campaign, that campaign. But he was not Marxist, but Lee Chang-bok, Yoon Sang-won, people like him has a vague orientation toward the working class. They not just sympathetic to working class, but they believe that without mobilization of working class, South Korea should not have a fundamental change to their society. I would like to compare them. It's like a 19th century Narodniki in Russia. They have some of Narodniki has a vague orientation toward working class, but they are not Marxist, But it was shocking to me the way he organized, the Yoon Sang organized the uprising and keep the uprising going. When Yoon Sang was just 30 years old, I don't know how old you guys are, but many of them, Michael should be over 30, right?
Don't call me out. I'm 32, yeah.
Yeah. We are pretty young. I mean, if you put yourself in that turmoil, the turbulent 10 days of the uprising, I mean, you should be disoriented. You don't know what to do. And then you just follow the crowd. But day 5 of uprising, Yoon Sang-won decided to publish a newspaper called 투사회보. Many of his comrades and many of the activists just follow the crowd. They raided the armory, they captured a firearm. That's a very exciting part of the uprising and a very scary part of it. But he's thinking to decide to publish a regular newspaper to channel that energy into the direction he wants to. That makes him so great. Thousands of young people took up arms and fought against the military. The few people sat back and think about what I should do now, what has to be done now seriously, and decide to publish a newspaper. That's a very brave thing to do. So without Yoon Sang-won and his small group, uprising should have not lasted for 10 days. That I can tell.
Yeah, kind of following up on that a little bit. So in Gwangju, I mean, there's the uprising, and there's temporarily this very radical governmental structure. I mean, it's sort of reminiscent of the Paris Commune in some ways. Like I'm always reminded of the Paris Commune when I think about the Gwangju Uprising in 1980, because there was this like very brief experiment in revolutionary democracy. So there were varying degrees of direct democracy, but there were obviously some contradictions. Can you talk a little bit about the structure of governance during the brief period of the uprising? How were people self-organizing the city?
1 year ago, I wrote an essay for Jacobin to exemplify Gwangju, to tell Gwangju was nothing special, to be honest. What happened to Gwangju should happen somewhere else. And over the course of 10 days, there are 4 groups emerged to lead the uprising. The first was the masses, ordinary people, who began to control the city after 5 days of fighting. But these people, moms and pop, ordinary young people, they don't know what to do. They want some direction as to what they want to do in the past over the course of 5 days. That's one group. And the second was among these masses, a new group of people emerged. I mean, new kind of organization began to form. With the government control gone, some people should take over some role of government to keep city running. I mean, you have to control traffic. You have to distribute food and the medicine. You have to organize a funeral. So they form they form a committee called Student Settlement Committee, SSC. But it's not, although they call themselves Student Settlement Committee, but it was also populated by ordinary citizens, labor unionists, students, religious leaders. They began to come together, run the city collectively. The third group was like an establishment figure, the politician, religious leader, who want to end the situation as soon as possible through dialogue with the military. So they call themselves Settlement Committee. And there was number 4 group, Yoon Sang-won's group, who published a daily paper, who organized a daily rally at the province hall. And the propaganda around the newspaper, keep around the newspaper on the one hand, and the mass participation around the rally on the other hand. These people keep uprising going for another 5 days. And eventually, some of the Student Settlement Committee and the militia who took up the arm during the uprising and the Yoon Sang-won's group come together, form a new committee called Fighting Committee. And they formed the committee on day 9 of the uprising. And the very next day, on day 10, militarily captured the city hall, province hall, killing many of them. So the new leadership during Gwangju Uprising was kind of a united front between the militia and some member of the Student Settlement Committee who managed the city on a daily basis, and Yoon Sang-won's group. I mean, that kind of a dual power structure emerging in every urban uprising situation, from Paris Commune to Petersburg in 1917, then 68 Paris, even Occupy Wall Street. We have a communist kitchen that we decide collectively every day on daily rally. So when Autobus went on 9 years ago, I was working nearby office, sadly. So I came down every day. I saw image of Gwangju, the collective rally where people make a collective decision. There's a communal kitchen, there's occupation, and they end up by police raid.
That's interesting. I'm glad you mentioned the different committees and factions. That's actually something I kind of want to ask about. Was like, what was the political scene like in Gwangju, like during and before the uprising? That, like you mentioned, Yoon Sang-won's organization, the National Democratic Workers League, which was also connected to the, correct me if I'm wrong, the National Democratic Students League, which was collectively called Haklim, or Student Forest, which you mentioned was unique because they're focused on labor. Actually, can you expand on that group for a bit?
I think their orientation, working class orientation, is very vague and abstract back then. Yoon Sang-won is an excellent leader because the only thing he could figure out back then, in my mind, is that he believed that at any cost, uprising should continue until the rest of the country rise up against Chun Do Hwan. That did not happen, but I strongly believe that that's the only plausible position you can take in a situation like that. You cannot surrender, and you cannot surrender unconditionally to military who just kill many innocent people because they stand under their last ground on the last day. We still claim to be a democracy. I mean, if they surrender, Gwangju Uprising would have gone history as some sort of urban unrest, not uprising. Like Miami riot in that year in Miami. Because they lasted 10 years and they fight to the last, it recorded as democratic resistance and democratic uprising, and that they become part of our tradition, our democratic tradition.
I just wanted to ask if you can kind of expand more on that dynamic, because I know that the citizen and even the student settlement committees were originally much more moderate. The Citizens Committee was more focused on trying to end the uprising with as little as possible. The Students' Committee was a bit more mixed between the moderates and the radicals, and Yoon Sang-won's group was the one that most focused ideologically on a grander vision outside the uprising. But that didn't happen overnight, right? It happened over a span of a couple of days. And I asked this as an organizer. I'm really interested in how Yoon Sang-won, his main tools for his group to take power in Gwangju was two things to mention, right? There was the newspaper, the Fighters Bulletin, and the Democracy Rallies. And I wanted to ask if you can expand on how to use those two tools to eventually take over leadership during the uprising.
Actually, Yoon Sang-won organized the commandeered vehicle. There are I think there are more than 20 military jeep. They seized from the military vehicle assembly line. He organized that into a freedom of propaganda team. He sent out that he installed speaker on the top of a jeep and sent out to the rest of the city, urging people to come to rally, urging people to continue to fight. At the rally, all major speakers voluntarily speak against negotiation with the military. Rally was a big tool, like an instrument to put pressure on this negotiator to stop negotiation with the military. Also, what Yoon Sang-won did was meet people and patiently explain why they should fight. And he won many of the militia, leading militia to his cause because he continuously meet people, talk with the people in and out of a province hall.
Do you think you could explain, just for our viewers, how these democracy rallies worked? Because I was told that they were sort of an interesting form of direct democracy.
Okay, Yoon Sang-won has a connection with a theatrical activist who organized activist play or staging activist play throughout the city. These activists are the one who organized the rally. They usually collect a list of speaker from crowd. They let them speak whatever they want to say throughout the rally. And many people, these ordinary citizens, took up the podium and say why they are against negotiation, why they should fight to the last, and so on and so forth. And the last day of one of the last rally, they torture Chun Do Hwan in effigy. So it was a very agitational event. At the same time, it's a very free event where everyone can speak. The majority of the Gwangju citizen analysts who does show up the rally was against the negotiation, and they want to keep the uprising going.
Remembering Gwangju today is significant because it wasn't just a local phenomenon. It wasn't just something that happened to the city of Gwangju. It gained a larger significance throughout the country, and for many it was the turning point for the democracy movement. And you can see a revival of Marxist thought and also a nationalism that is highly critical of the US, which before then was still seen as a kind of harbinger of liberal democracy. After Gwangju, that view was challenged a lot. What was it about Gwangju that was so transformative for Korean politics?
So for many young Koreans, the tragic end of the uprising basically proved Marx was right. Karl Marx was right. To me, it proved Karl Marx was right on 2 points. The first, the state was the instrument of the ruling class and kill ordinary people just for making their demand. The other thing that surprised me as a young man was that more workers were killed than students, showing who actually waged the uprising to the rest. Many young people, many students, and many young workers began to question the fundamental role of the government should play, and the role of the masses, and obviously Marxism offered an answer. I think you said it was revival of Marxism, but that's understatement because Koreans were over the 1950 and then through 1953, literally crushed every single leftist in South Korea. A Korean War was a massacre where 3 million civilians were killed, but many of them are leftist. So there was a big vacuum of the leftist party in South Korea. But Gwangju changed that. By mid-90s, by 1985, Marxism, usually Soviet official variant or Stalinism, become a major tendency in student and labor movement. And obviously, it was the U.S. who supported Chun Do Hwan and was backfired by nationalism in South Korea. And that Juche, North Korean official ideology, became a majority in student movement back then.
I read in Making of Minjung that there was a saying back then. They said that like all roads led back to Gwangju, and I was just kind of curious, what was it about we talked about how Gwangju led to a change in certain political thought among the democracy movement, but what was it about Gwangju that was seen as so fundamental to the democracy movement that it was seen as a turning point?
I think over the 18 years of Park Chung-hee rule, there are mass imprisonment of political opponents. But Park Chung-hee never brought in troops to kill people. Chun Do Hwan did. So it was a big wake-up call for many students and leftists to show how state can be violent, how they should respond to it. And again, you cannot find the answer in major mainstream politics or mainstream textbook. So people look to Marxism and Juche as an alternative to political status quo back then.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting in the Gwangju Uprising is in 1980, and as you mentioned, it triggers this interest in the student movement. The student movement starts sort of like ideologically orienting towards more kind of Marxism, Leninism, Juche, etc. Whereas in much of the rest of the world, those political tendencies are declining. But in Korea, it has this unique resurgence throughout the 80s. And it's kind of funny too, because Chun Do Hwan, I was reading the other day, he still insists to this day that the Gwangju Uprising was North Korean commandos. So there's always been this sort of right-wing conspiracy theory about the uprising being orchestrated by North Korea. And then there's also going through that experience politically, then pushes a lot of these student activists to start taking Marxism more seriously, looking at North Korea as a possible model. I mean, what were people thinking about North Korea at that time? So after the uprising, people started getting more interested in Juche, the official ideology of North Korea, Marxism, Leninism. What were some of the discussions around that?
Actually, one of my senior activists, who is very pro-Juche, told me that there's no massacre in North Korea. North Korean leader never killed hundreds of innocent people. So that's why he believed that North Korea is fundamentally better than South Korea. That's the general sentiment or general feeling about North Korea back then. It's obviously the North Korea depict itself as a kind of a familial state. Big Daddy take care of small people. So it was I believe that it was a very interesting thing to say. There's no massacre in North Korea, but hey, there's a famine in North Korea. That's much worse than massacre, I have to say now. But that's a general sentiment about what people feel about North Korea. Because over the past, on surface, over the course of 5 decades, North Korea didn't have any political turmoil. Nobody knows what happened there, but there's no coup, there's no massacre, there's no mass protest. I don't know whether it's a good thing or not to have a mass protest in any place, but that's what happened in North Korea. And North Koreans look very independent as against U.S. imperialism. And many activists consider Chun Do Hwan as a lapdog of Ronald Reagan. Partly true, yeah, he was a lapdog. And there's something about North Korea that boosts many people's national pride. He stands alone, quiet, familiar, very generous leader, which is not true, but That's how they picture them. And they look to north of DMZ because South Korea saw such a terrible place to be back then. Police is everywhere. Police on the campus. Police on the street. They stop and frisk all the time. Having some sort of radical book land you into jail. Then North Korea, to many people, North Korea is not what South Korea is. That's why they look to North Korea. There are many things I want to say about North Korea, what they didn't do during this period. I mean, North Korean elite treat South Korean left as if to lead a child. I mean, the way they talk about it, the way they do about it, very condescending. There's some air of superiority among North Korea elite over their one following South Korea. That's another subject we should talk about some other time. But people look to North Korea because it's not South Korea. It's the antithesis to South Korea. Kim Il-sung was antithesis to Chun Do Hwan back then. So if someone is totally opposite to Chun Do Hwan, that someone should be your friend. That someone can be your ally. Yeah. I think that's the beginning of a national liberation fraction. And it's easy to understand national liberation fraction or 주체 because mostly all written in Korean. Very easy to follow, right? It's not idea. It's more like a code of ethics code. I mean, you should be nice to the people. You should not do this, do that with the people. It's a moral code. It's not ideology. It's easy to follow. That's why it was so spread so fast. It became popular among the students, especially students. That remains true now.
Can you briefly talk a little bit about the difference between PD, People's Democracy, and NL, National Liberation, for those who may not know that these are kind of the two divisions?
PD is like a People's Democracy. If North Korea, I mean, National Liberation, NL fraction rely on North Korea. Meanwhile, PD basically study official Marxism of Russia. PD or People's Democracy is based on official Marxism of the Soviets or Eastern Europe. I still remember reading 세계 철학사, or History of Global Philosophy. It was a textbook used in USSR in 1970s at high school. So people loved that book, and I read it too. And obviously it presents more radical vision than North Korean 주체 idea, but they are all imploded by the 1989 when Eastern Europe collapsed. So it's interesting that South Korean activists back then did not even consider about Western style social democracy. So basically they believe that they cannot take a power through election because Chun Do Hwan was such a strong military man. So he had to be overthrown. So we have to skip social democracy view, that directly go to more radical view, like a 주체 idea or Soviet Marxism.
Well, it's kind of interesting to point out about like how you said like there wasn't really like a social democratic current among the student movement because Kim Dae-jung wasn't a Marxist or Abe-juchis. He was just a liberal. So I'm actually curious, like what was the relationship between the pro-democracy politicians like Kim Dae-jung or
Kim Il-sung?
Yeah, it's like these were just moderates and liberals, and so I was curious, what is the relationship between them and the more radical student activists?
By international standard, neither Kim Dae-jung or Kim Il-sung are progressive or liberal. They are very conservative. They always part of a system. Kim Dae-jung was an industrialist before becoming a politician. And Kim Il-sung was the son of a very rich family in Gyeongsang province. I mean, because general democratic right was not allowed in South Korea, these moderate, conservative and moderate should play role as a progressive to bring about democratic right in South Korea. But they are fundamentally moderate conservative, I have to say. What did Kim Dae-jung do as a president? He did many great things, but he was a big believer in neoliberalism. He deregulated the labor market, first of all. he deregulated capital market, and that's what we have today. Rise of temporary work in South Korea, and the rampant corporate greed in South Korea. That's all made possible by Kim Dae-jung, Kim Yong-sam, and Roh Moo-hyun. They are great politicians on their own right, but their politics basically has nothing to do with the progressive agenda. But given the political and the historical situation they were faced with, they did what they do, and that they did better than, say, Chun Do Hwan or other military dictators. At least they respect and they expand the democratic right in South Korea. But besides that, economic inequality, political justice, they are basically pretty much moderate conservative. And if they were in US or Europe, they should be regarded as a conservative figure rather than liberal.
The Gwangju Uprising, kind of in a lot of ways initiated by students. My understanding is that this was the student movement in Gwangju was originally part of a national movement, a national plan to have these sort of synchronized national student strikes that would trigger a broader uprising that could take down the military regime. I think the idea was the students would go out first and the workers would join later. But I read an interesting article a while back that apparently the leadership of the national student movement in Seoul became aware that the movement had been infiltrated by agents of the state, and they had called off and canceled demonstrations, but they were not able to get in contact with the students in Gwangju. So basically, the folks in Gwangju went ahead with the plan, not knowing that everything had been called off nationally. So Gwangju was sort of alone as they took their stand. Can you talk a little bit about that? Is what I read correct? Can you talk about how Gwangju is related to the student movement nationwide, and to what extent it was part of a broader strategy?
I tell you, who wrote that piece is paranoid. Actually, the South National Student Leadership decided to stop protest as of May 15 because they could not gain any popular support. During May 14 to May 12 to May 14, over the 3 days, students nationwide took to the street, but ordinary citizens did not join their protest. They stay on sideline. So the student leadership began to figure out how to get popular support, because if they don't get the popular support, or if they cannot make their protest bigger and stronger, they're going to be crushed by military. So they decide to take some time off, figure out what next step should be. But Gwangju was the only city where there was a student protest on May 15, and many citizens joined that protest. That protest lasted until early next morning, May 17. It was a peaceful demonstration, and even the college professor, after announcing their one statement, joined the student protest. That they have a huge rally in front of Province Hall with the students and the thousands of ordinary citizens. If Gwangju was singled out by military, I think that might be true. That's because it was the only city still had a protest 2 days before coup on May 16. So when the Jeonnam University students began to challenge paratroopers who occupied their school on the morning of May 18, unlike other regions, these students were very excited, imbued with excitement, because they had a very strong rally, a very strong protest, joined by ordinary citizens, as well as their own professor 2 days ago. They are more confident than other regions, so they began to challenge paratroopers at the gate of Jeonnam University. And obviously paratroopers fight back, crushed them, and these students went to downtown, occupied the street, and the ordinary citizens joined. That's the beginning of the uprising. So Gwangju was very unique. Again, 20% of entire population is student. And many people got pissed off by Chung Hee because they couldn't find a job. they are just poor. Economic opportunity was not there. Every possible economic opportunity kind of sidelined them. There is a full of people who want to see change. And that these people had the great rally, great protest 2 days before the coup. That confidence somehow make them challenge the military rule, strike back on May 18th. Well, for that reason, maybe Chun Do Hwan and his colleagues single out Gwangju, but that's not the only, they just not choose Gwangju arbitrarily, because they have to handle Gwangju because Gwangju fight to the last. Gwangju was the first city to come out and the last city to go home. That's why they have to handle Gwangju or turn a strike back to Gwangju. I kind of always opposed to some sort of conspiracy theory about Gwangju Uprising. Yeah, Chun Do Hwan single out Gwangju, or Chun Do Hwan hate Gwangju so much they send a paratrooper to that city. No, that's not true. That's not true. They have three brigade of paratroopers in South Korea back then. And about 60,000 paratrooper soldiers occupy all major college campus nationwide. All major cities, not just Gwangju. Gwangju never been singled out. But if Gwangju was singled out by military, because they are the one who fight the last. Because they hold their ground until last moment.
You talked about how like Gwangju was singled out. Gwangju was unique because they fought to the end. It was, that kind of reminded me of something that set Yoon Sang-won apart from the other groups. Was Yoon Sang-won had this vision, right? He had this belief that like every like city or town should set up cells that sort of force the military to make a decision of was like you either shoot us and prove yourself barbarians, or you give up and let the military regime fall. And it kind of made me think, it's like, what did the mass people of Gwangju like want? What was their vision for this uprising? What did they hope to achieve?
I think vision is an overstatement because nobody has a big picture. I want to make it clear that nobody had a big or clear picture as to what happened, as to what they want to do. But Gwangju people was not driven by ideologically. They just reacted to brutal violence by military initially. And the Yoon Sang-won didn't have a picture. But Yoon Sang-won has a good instinct as an activist. He believed that whatever the cost, the uprising should go on until the rest of the country rise up, as I told you earlier. That's the good instinct, but it was never been materialized. Just think about that. Just think about differently. If Yoon Sang-won and his comrade and the militia desert the province or surrender to the military, what would happen? How would we remember Gwangju today? It's just another urban disturbance. It was not uprising. It was the urban disturbance by some hooligan or by troublemakers. As Yoon Sang-won say at the very last night of the uprising, we die tonight to live forever. It was a military defeat, but it was not political defeat at all. They made a point by holding the ground until the last moment. Nobody, again, it's just overstatement that Yoon Sang-won know everything, or Yoon Sang-won has the big picture. He doesn't know next to nothing about what happened. But the only thing he knows, because he has very good insight and instinct, uprising should not end in surrender. That's the only thing he knew. He was right.
I kind of want to touch on what you said about how many people were sort of driven by individuals, especially the sort of police brutality, in the Gwangju Uprising, or in the Guangzhou Diary, I mean. There's a very vivid account where it mentions a paratrooper takes out a knife and he says, I used this knife to cut the breast of 40 VC women, which is, Vietcong. And it, that was seen as a major point of shock to the people. And I kind of me wonder, was that an example of, maybe not Guangzhou being singled out, but that was it that the military government was just especially cruel to the people of Guangzhou?
Actually, one of the reports by DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency of the U.S., states that the paratrooper treat Guangzhou citizens as if Vietcong, because many paratroopers fought in Vietnam some years back before they came down to Guangzhou, massacring people. And obviously they liken Guangzhou city, paratrooper liken Guangzhou citizen to Vietcong because of a regional bias. Guangzhou people are secondary citizens in South Korea back then. So they raided the Guangzhou though as if they raided a village in Vietnam. They crashed and burned the city.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious about Chun Do Hwan's role in all this. So, Gwangju Uprising is in 1980. Park Chung Hee is assassinated in 1979. And for listeners who may not know, he was, kind of the strongman, right-wing, military-affiliated president who's in the right wing of Korean politics. South Korean politics is regarded by some as sort of having fostered the development of South Korea after the Korean War. So he is assassinated in 1979, and then there's this sort of very unstable period immediately after that where it's not exactly clear how succession works and who is going to take power afterwards. And then Chun Do Hwan launches the coup d'etat that installs his government, and they end up being the ones who crack down on Gwangju. Can you talk a little bit about that coup, just briefly? What was Chun Do Hwan's motivation? How was the U.S. involved? Presumably they had to approve of this coup, I assume. Can you talk a little bit about that little context between Park Chung Hee's assassination and Chun Do Hwan's coup?
After studying about Chun Do Hwan 20 years, I believe that Chun Do Hwan think he should be a president sometime. He believed that he deserved the presidency after Park Chung Hee. And Park Chung Hee was assassinated by his own intelligence officer in 1979. And he staged a small coup in December of that year by rounding up senior general. And he took control of military, not just the military, he took control of all intelligence agency, military and civilian, KCIA and the DIA of Korea. So he had the power, he seized the power by the month of May in 1980. It was a generational shift in South Korean military because his senior officer or senior general were the Korean War veteran. The Chun Do Hwan and his clique were Vietnam War veteran. Unlike his senior officer, Chun Do Hwan was educated in U.S., Fort Benning. He was trained in special warfare and psychological warfare. So he believed that his senior officer are too old and retire, and it was his turn to be a president. On December 2020, or December, we call this 2020 incident, because it happened December 2020. 2 days after December 20, coup, he was invited by Gleisten of U.S., the U.S. ambassador back then, to U.S. ambassador's one residence in South Korea, the Habib House. And it was unusual for U.S. invite a general who arrested his senior officer and killed senior officer 2 days ago to his own residence. So it was obviously taxi approved by U.S. The meeting was arranged by then CIA Seoul station chief, and Gleisten basically followed his advice and they invited Chun Do Hwan to his own residence. Mike might know where the residence is, the ambassadorial residence in Seoul. You know where it is? It's not embassy. It's not embassy. U.S. residence is right across the Jeolla news press agency. So when Chun Do Hwan was invited to show up at their residence, he was accompanied by a truckload of security guard. Basically, he got invitation from ambassador. He going to inside the house to major news agency. Even though it was not reported because of censorship, but rumors spread widely in the next morning in South Korea. Chun Do Hwan got invitation from ambassador. They have a talk. One of the military attaché to embassy then, he said in his memoir that after that meeting between Chun Do Hwan and the U.S. ambassador Gleisten, he got many phone calls from South Korean friend, journalist, military general, politician, asking actually U.S. approve Chun Do Hwan as the next leader of South Korea.
So there was this like tacit approval of the coup from the U.S.
Already in December 14, 2 days after his brutalized the power in the military. Yeah, Carter regime. Personally, I think Carter is racist, especially he's very anti-Korean racist. He believed that South Korea has no ability to perform on democratic order. So he believed that another military dictator should take over South Korea could take care of these one people. Gleisten, the ambassador to Korea back then, was the son of a American Christian Christian missionary in China. He was very racist too. Actually, he preached about democracy with the South Korean politicians all the time. It was a very racist decision by Jimmy Carter to support Chun Do Hwan.
Well, you still see that narrative a little bit too with like when you talk to right-wingers in South Korea. I mean, when they talk about Park Chung Hee and Chun Do Hwan, that kind of era generally, it's sort of like, well, at that time, bad things happened, but, South Koreans, they just weren't ready for democracy yet. It's like as if they were children who were like, they had to be taken care of. Yeah, it's this weird paternalistic way of talking about it. It's like Gwangju proves that they were very ready for a much more radical democracy than we have now. But yeah, you see that narrative not just in South Korea, but all over the place.
And there's a racist.
The U.S. has to be the custodian of these.
If you go to if you have a chance to go to WikiLeaks and read the U.S. Embassy cable between the State Department and the U.S. Embassy during that period, there's a strong racist condensation. They just look down to Korean people, Korean opponents, opposition leaders, Korean students, as if like a young child who have no idea whatsoever about real world. And they somehow praise military leaders, conservative politicians, conservative Christian, as if the only adult in the room.
We talked about how the Gwangju Uprising wasn't really driven by ideology, or it was driven by this sort of unique moment in history. If you go to a lot of the many museums in Guangzhou, there's usually an exhibit where they try to trace the Gwangju Uprising to this long tradition of political dissent in the Jeolla region. Like you go back to the peasant uprising, the Donghak rebellion, the righteous armies during Japanese occupation. And I was curious, do you think that's sort of inaccurate or a reinterpretation of the history of the uprising and how they frame it?
I would say it's not accurate, but there's some overstatement about that. That's how usually history is written after many years later. I think it's enough to say that. I don't wanna offend anybody. But it's very depressing, even frustrating to see that all this momentum on the museum none of these museums do not depict Gwangju as an urban uprising. Gwangju was the first ever uprising in South Korea history. Why do they try to link that uprising with what happened 500 years ago or 5,000 years ago, even some cases? Gwangju Uprising is a very modern capitalist phenomenon. Probably has little nothing to do with that historical background. Obviously, Jeolla, I told you earlier, inequality is endemic to the region and so on and so forth, but it's a very urban event. That's why this socialist podcast should be excited with Gwangju in a way, because that's what we like about Gwangju. This is urban event. None of the official records show that or depict that way.
I had a quick follow-up question, something that I was thinking about. I'm curious if the participants in the Gwangju Uprising were taking any inspiration at all, or were looking towards the example of the Jeju Uprising in 1948-49. So for listeners who may not know, Jejudo is an island in South Korea. In 1947, I believe, into the next year, 1948, 1949, there was an uprising on the island in opposition against plans to divide the Korean peninsula. I kind of associate the two uprisings in my mind in some ways. So I'm wondering if the Gwangju Uprising, if there was any inspiration taken or what lessons they were drawing from the Jeju Uprising?
Actually, answer is no, because back then few people would know about what happened Jeju Island in that period. The Jeju Massacre or Jeju, because it was massacres. Basically, the U.S. and the South Korean military decimate the Jeju population, i.e., they kill 1 in every 10 people there, right? The decimation.
10 to 20% of the population,
but
I think, was killed.
It was virtually unknown to outside the Jeju Island back then. The Jeju Massacre became known to public, I think it's in late 1980s.
That actually makes me wonder, what was it about Gwangju that was different? There were so many horrible massacres in Korea, and Jejudo. There was many massacres that happened in even the Gyeongsang-do region during the Korean War.
Okay, that's a great point. Actually, that's why I hate when people depict what happened in Gwangju as a massacre. It was a massacre. Of course, it was a massacre, but it was uprising. They were massacred because they rose up. I mean, you cannot even liken what happened in Gwangju to Jejudo. Jejudo was a massacre, but.
Well, wasn't there an uprising as well in Jejudo? Because wasn't it it started out because the communists revolted?
There were demonstrations, and it was gone down by military. And after that, it was basically guerrilla warfare after that. To me, I mean, Jejudo was a sad event, very depressing event, but it was a rural event compared with what happened in Gwangju. Gwangju was a very urban event.
Well, it's harder to hide what happened in Guangzhou than what happened in... Well,
because
that too, and just the time scale too. It was easier to hide things in 1948 versus 1980 with media.
And they happened in Ireland, really isolated islands back then.
So what is the public memory, or maybe we could talk about more of social movements in general, of how they remember Gwangju, how it still influences it? Are there any tensions within public memory and that of social movements? So one thing I'm bringing this up is the divide in this cemetery. So you will have some people who just want to preserve the memory of Gwangju as it was a massacre, some resistance, but a massacre nonetheless. And then you would have more radical strains trying to revitalize that memory, see how that talks and connects to contemporary social movements, and therefore bury the martyrs of contemporary social struggles in the Gwangju.
I think it's great to see that now every student in South Korea learn about Gwangju as school, unlike in 1980s or 1990s. That's a good thing. But I think how we memorialize the Gwangju is closely related with the general condition of South Korean democracy. Gwangju is a bellwether of South Korean democracy. When South Korean democracy became weaker under the conservative government of Park Geun-hye and Lee Myung-bak, there was rise of May 18 denialism back then. Because when they tried to attack democracy, they tended to attack legacy of May 18. So Gwangju, the way how people perceive, how people memorize the Gwangju, closely related to the condition of South Korean democracy. I think they would not change in the future.
Yeah, it's interesting. We've talked about this before a little bit, but like the way the Gwangju Uprising is like kind of talked about in the broader like general popular culture. For example, the film Taxi Driver, which for people who may not know, Taxi Driver, it's roughly based on a true story. Taxi Driver drives this German journalist into Gwangju during the uprising, and he is able to expose what is occurring. Anyway, well-made film, but Bori and I have talked about this, and I've heard other Korean comrades kind of express displeasure with that film and some other sort of cultural products around the Gwangju Uprising, that there's this sort of like liberal framework of looking at the Gwangju Uprising and South Korea's like military dictatorship period is like, well, yes, the country was fucked up in the past, but now we're a bourgeois democracy and everything's fine. We finished it. Democracy movement accomplished all of its goals. Capitalism's great. We love having U.S. troops here. And it's sort of like, it's sort of presented as if the democracy movement it's like a finished thing. Like it's accomplished its mission. It's not an ongoing social struggle. And, versus, more radical ways of framing the Gwangju Uprising as being in continuity with contemporary social struggles. So I don't know. I was curious what you think about that. What do you think about that film, Taxi Driver? What do you think about the way that, it reminds me of the U.S., for example. The U.S., the civil rights movement is very sanitized, right? It's like, well, we were racist a few decades ago, but we've fixed all of that. We have our MLK Day parade and everything's great now. It's sort of there's like a liberal way of approaching the Gwangju Uprising legacy that reminds me of that. So I don't know. What do you think about that film and the way that liberals frame the legacy of the Gwangju Uprising?
Taxi Drivers, I think a good movie. Everyone who want to know about Gwangju, I strongly recommend that they should watch the film. But it's not okay. The movie are not great medium for us to study history. The movies are movies, so I strongly urge people to read the book Guangzhou Diary. There are many books about Gwangju now and about South Korean modern history and democracy. I hope people read more books, do less Facebook. And it's an inspirational movie, but, well, I don't like the end scene. There's a chase scene where taxi driver protects this particular taxi carrying foreign journalists, but that did not happen. Like many films do, that film has its one flaw, but it's nice to start with, but that's not to be end of your exploration into South Korean history. Democracy is a very fragile thing. If you don't protect, if you don't renew, democracy have to decline. I mean, that's what exactly happened under Trump. There are many scary moments when the Trump was president. And that's the democracy. Democracy should be protected. Democracy should be renewed every possible moment. I believe, I have to repeat myself, in South Korea, in any future, if someone wants to attack democracy or undermine democratic gain South Korea have made in the past 3 decades, he or she would attack legacy of May 18. So the May 18 is the bellwether of South Korean democracy. How you see that 10 days of uprising would it determine what kind of person you are. It determines whether you are conservative, whether you are reactionary, whether you are liberal, or whether you are radical or Marxist. Again, as some sort of radical, I kind of ashamed to call myself radical this day, but as a former radical, I say, I hate when people depict Gwangju as a tragedy or some sort of sad fracture point in the history. But it was a great story. It was a great moment in South Korean history. Ordinary citizens come together and defeat the most well-trained elite force in South Korean history, and they control the city for 5 days. They were not perfect. There are many problems, but they still somehow did it. It was a very eye-opening moment in my life. I mean, I'm a son of a middle-class family, and I was trained to hate working class. I was trained to look down upon ordinary people. Gwangju changed me in a fundamental way. I mean, I began to, after reading the Guangzhou Diary, I began to break up with the regional bias. I was under that influence for the rest of my life, but I tried to make a break with the regional bias. I tried to have a big respect for the ordinary people. I come to understand that sympathy is not enough to change the world. You need a solidarity and empathy to change the world. That's what I learned from Gwangju when I was in high school, as I read the Gwangju Diary. It was great. I was very fortunate to have a chance to translate back that book in the late 1990s. I mean, obviously, I have many issues and conflict with many Gwangju leaders now, but the way they remember Gwangju or their legacy has nothing to do with the way I should remember them, the Yoon Sang-won and others. They have their own tradition, and I have mine. In other words, you don't have to cherish Gwangju Diary the way Kim Dae-jung or Gwangju leader or Moon Jae-in would remember about Gwangju. I think it's very important to keep the radical version of Gwangju history, because it's a very inspirational story for anyone who want to change the world. And personally, when I have a top choice, I try to put myself in province hall on the last day of uprising. What would I do? Should I leave the province hall, go back to my family, or should I fight to the last? And when I frame my decision in that fashion, at least I make a decision that's principled. I could make many principled decisions which turn out to be very stupid, because that sometimes means I have to take on my boss, or sometimes undermine my job security and so on. But I'm done with the corporate world now, so I can say that. But I often put myself in someone's shoes. What should I do? What's the principal decision I should make here? What is the principal choice here? Well, there was not bad compass for me. But that's not always the right decision, but I have to say, but principal decision. I think you know what I mean.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. We just talked about the legacy of the Gwangju Uprising. So in Hong Kong, there have been recent protests over what's perceived as, I guess, mainland China encroaching on Hong Kong's kind of autonomous status. And that movement has been singing March for the Beloved, which is considered an anthem of the Gwangju Uprising. Can you talk more about the Gwangju Uprising's legacy internationally, in Hong Kong or elsewhere? Like, how did this event, this struggle, inspire movements abroad?
Actually, Gwangju put South Korea on political map globally. I mean, when I came to this country to study at New School at social research, many people ask about Gwangju, and there are no good English book about Gwangju. That's why I decided to translate Guangzhou Diary with Ning Mamatas back then. But let me tell you some story I never told publicly before. It was a Gwangju that helped Trotskyism take a root in South Korea. Mike was a Trotskyist, I heard.
Yeah, I'm a recovering Trotskyist, yes.
I was a Trotskyist too, because I don't consider myself anyone now. But in 1987, at Yonsei University, a student leader at Yonsei University met with someone from Hong Kong who introduced himself as a journalist. But he was a member of October Review, a tiny Trotskyist group in Hong Kong. He came to Seoul to meet with a South Korean activist to sow seed of Trotskyism in South Korea. So these two guys, the Yonsei activist and the Hong Kong Trotskyist, began to talk about politics, began to talk about book Hong Kong activists brought into Seoul. But their conversation did not go well because of language barrier. Hong Kong Trotskyists could not speak Korean, and the South Korean activist was not fluent in spoken English. So they swapped Chinese character to communicate each other. So conversation was interesting, but it didn't go further than that. One day, South Korean
That's
activists...
really interesting. I didn't know that.
So this Hong Kong activist, among the student activists, throwing firebomb at riot police. I mean, back then the student protests were very, very violent. The Molotov cocktail was very common then. But this Chinese man, who stand out obviously from other Korean, throwing firebomb at riot police, South Korean activists took away him into the corner, tell him what kind of serious problem he can cause by throwing firebomb as a foreigner to riot police. Then Hong Kong activists ask when they find in Gwangju, you would not find in Seoul. Hong Kong activists ask Korean activists saying, when they find in Gwangju, you would not find in Seoul. The major reason why Hong Kong activists come to Seoul to meet student activists in there to organize with the Trotskyism was the Gwangju. He learned about Gwangju and decided to come to Seoul to kind of make a connection politically with the Trotskyism. That's how Trotskyism started in South Korea.
That's an interesting history, yeah.
That's one side of the story, and that the other side is like a Korean student who studied in U.S., met with the Trotskyists, and they imported that idea to U.S. But this side of the story, Yonsei University activists who met Hong Kong Trotskyists who came to Seoul after he knows about Gwangju. So international solidarity can happen in a very strange way.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Wow.
And I studied with this Yonsei University student, Yonsei University activist, many years later. But he told when he talked about this story, he still cried. But he's no longer politically active anymore. So I don't want to reveal his name, but I tried to track down this Hong Kong trotskist many years. Kamlan is his name, so I still track down, but nobody knows where he's whereabouts now. He might be in Macau or Hong Kong, they say. But the October Review group has been disbanded afterward, so nobody knows.
So I guess one thing I could add, that was a wonderful story at first, but one thing I could add about dispelling the myth about there being infiltration into Gwangju, that's the right-wing myth about the Gwangju Uprising, was the amount of how, what kind of ideology the revolt was based on. From my understanding, it was for a fulfillment of liberal democracy rather than something more radical than that, to the extent that this was an anecdote that I heard of the citizens of Gwangju being suspicious that some of the activists were just way too articulate, so they almost handed that activist over to the police. But because they were suspecting that activist to be some sort of North Korean spy. So the anti-communist liberal democracy was the ideal for the majority of participants. Luckily, that activist was able to talk out of that predicament by showing them where they lived and that they were actually part of the community of the city as well.
Actually, yeah, there were North Korean agents in Gwangju back then. And in one day, actually, protesters apprehend one of the suspicious figure and give them to military. He turned out to be a North Korean agent.
It's insane.
That's true.
Oh my
but
God.
What's important is that overall, North Korea has no influence whatsoever over the direction of the uprising.
Oh yeah, that was the point I was trying to make.
Yeah,
The point was that the citizens were so that they had internalized the anti-communist liberal democracy sort of propaganda.
Yeah, it was anti-communist uprising.
Exactly.
Anti-North Korea uprising.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's actually interesting you point out. There's something I found kind of unique about, maybe not unique about the Guangzhou Uprising, but something you don't see with current protests was many of the protesters were waving South Korean flags, right? There's we're fulfilling the ideals of South Korean democracy. And, I remember Han King's book, Human X. She actually kind of I don't want to say critiques it, but she doesn't romanticize it you normally see in other media depictions of the uprising. It's why are you flying the flag of the government that's killing you?
Yeah. That's what they call limit to the uprising. I mean, there are many contradictory things happening inside the uprising. Why it was very anti-communist uprising. At the same time, they ignore personal private property, occupied the factory, seized the vehicle, and so on. So they say one thing, they did another. But that kind of self-contradiction happened in every uprising like Gwangju. So I would not be surprised. I mean, Gwangju uprising is a very complex event, and that you cannot just simply explain what happened in Gwangju in a narrow ideological view. I mean, it was a popular uprising. At least half of the city, or 300,000 people joined in one way or another over the course of 10 days. So you can, it's a really variety of people were there, all walks of life. You cannot narrow down into one single ideological perspective. That's absurd.
And then we can also talk about how, although Yun Sang-won was not a Marxist per se, a lot of the student activists were reading documents about the Paris Commune. That was a clear inspiration for their organizing.
I mean, he was not Marxist, but let me put it this way: he was not Marxist, but he read the uprising better than any Marxist would have.
Well, also there weren't any Marxists back then.
I'm quite curious though about this Paris Commune reading group because I've heard about it as well. Did it have any influence in the uprising? I was told there was some notable activists who were part of that reading group at one point.
I think the only book about Paris Commune back then was a Japanese book by Japanese. So I don't know how accurate that book about the Paris Commune, but I don't think he was directly inspired by Paris Commune. That's overstretching.
Well, obviously you can't orchestrate the Guangzhou Uprising to become the Paris Commune just by the sole reading of a book by a few activists. But it's interesting to see that the core activists drew inspiration from it in some sense. And then you can see how the events actually played out. You can't say it was the cause for how the events played out, obviously, but it's also another pushback to, yes, it wasn't ideological driven in the way we usually perceive it, but it would be also silly to say that there were no ideological elements. It's just...
I wouldn't say there's no ideological influence on Gwangju, but I think his one insight and instinct are more important than any ideology he might harbor.
You critiqued sort of the liberal framing around Gwangju as overly cultural. I was curious, is there any sort of substance to like the concept of like 대동세상, or would you consider that just mostly inaccurate?
That's absurd concept. I hate it. What does it mean by 대동세상? It's becoming big one? I mean, many rich people deserted the city during the uprising. Many students escaped the city. It's not 대동세상. It's not becoming one word. Those who have to stay. Those who need to stay. But those who have to leave the city. That's mystical. I mean, I hate that kind of narrative. How do people stop using that term?
Yeah, and I think one of the proponents of that view interprets the Gwangju Uprising and very delimits it to the point where there was a commune. It talks about the absolute community, and I think that kind of interpretation is very depolitical, anti-political, in that it just specializes, gives priority to one aspect of the events to the detriment to anything else, and then makes everything else kind of meaningless.
And they mystify what happened in Gwangju.
Exactly.
Yeah, I'm so shocked that liberals have very little understanding of material conditions. But
yeah, that's important. We should restore the material interpretation of uprising.
Yes. Gotta bring that Marx, baby.
I wouldn't say we should say Marx, but
Yeah, well, your article did come out in the Jacobin. That is a Marxist magazine.
Mm-hmm. Well, who needs Marxism when you have Juche, right?
Yeah, I know, but the reason why I wrote this is that I was so pissed off by the mainstream politician in Gwangju.
Roughly 4 decades have passed since the Gwangju Uprising. A lot has changed in Gwangju since then. Besides the obvious, democratization. I was wondering, how do Gwangju and Jeolla provinces fit in Korea's political economic scene? The population's been dropping like most areas now that more than half the population lives in that urban monster we call Seoul. It's no offense to my Seoul comrades.
Pride.
But yeah. But what role does declining rural areas? I guess Gwangju is not really a rural area, but it is somewhat rural. Like near if you drive 30 minutes anywhere, you hit rice fields.
It's a rural area. I mean, I think Gwangju is still a victim of regional bias. Gwangju is a very sad city. I mean, 4 years ago, I could visit the city twice within like 10 months apart of each other. Each time I arrived at the city by bus from Incheon Airport very late night. Then I was surprised at the fleet of 18-wheeler at toll gates. All these trucks carry auto part to Kia motor assembly line in the city. And I was so surprised that that assembly line has not been expanded for like 60 years since the colonial era. And there was no automobile manufacturing cluster as they have in Gyeongsang province. So they have to bring every single part from Gyeongsang province to this Kia assembly line. That's serious problem. Now they have a new Hyundai motor plant going to online soon, but that plant is heavily subsidized by taxpayers' money to keep jobs in Gwangju. It's like Gwangju is basically welfare case for central government now.
Yeah, it is interesting. I've been to the Jeolla a couple times, and you do get the sense that this whole region of the country, the southwest. So for people who may not know, Jeolla is the province, Gwangju is the major city. This is in the southwest of South Korea. It does feel very like isolated from the rest of the country's infrastructure. Like, for example, there's no direct train from Busan to Gwangju. It's like, it is. It does. When you go there, you do get the sense that this is like an underinvested and sort of part of the country.
And also, economic inequalities are so stark in the city. High-rise condominium dominate the skyline in new districts like Seoul. That's basically thanks to the speculative fund from Seoul and elsewhere. Now the tenement building where Yoon Sang-won print to survive writer's bulletin is now in danger of demolition now because developer want build a luxury condominium there. That's heartbreaking.
So I remember reading a couple of years ago in an article that the Gwangju city government came up with sort of a model. So we talk about, assembly lines that in order to keep jobs in Gwangju, they agreed that new manufacturing workers would accept half the wage of existing workers. And it was dubbed the Gwangju model. And Moon Jae-in ended up praising it. So we should bring this nationwide. And I thought that was such a tragic thing that the city known for political dissent is now becoming sort of a laboratory for neoliberalism.
That's the Korean version of two-tier model. Exactly.
Yeah, in the U.S. we call it the two-tier model. Similar thing with car manufacturing companies. New hired workers accept lower benefits and wages, which destroys solidarity between workers because the younger workers have animosity towards the older workers. It's a very clever strategy on the part of neoliberalism. If you want to drive workers against each other, a two-tier model.
It is. I mean, you talked about how a core of the population were young people in Gwangju. I don't think that's the case anymore. Most of the people I meet in Gwangju are the elderly or they're families.
Local college is no longer popular among locals. They will go to Seoul to study or other country to study. I mean, decline of local economy hit every major city in South Korea, but Gwangju is the hardest hit. Because Gwangju always had a problem economically. It got worse.
Oh, I was just going to ask, because of that, obviously, sort of consolidation of cities at the expense of local areas hits me personally hard, not just because, my family's from Gwangju, I lived in Iowa where we had sort of a similar issue of just entire towns just disappearing. Even entire states in the Midwest are just depopulating because of over-urbanization and suburbanization. But it makes me wonder, is there still, with that framework in mind, is it still possible to organize politically in Gwangju? Or is all the political activity now reduced to Seoul or the Gyeonggi-do area?
I think Hope nobody in power Gwangju should listen to this. I think what Gwangju needs most is like a generation shift in their politics. Young people should take initiative.
Well, it's just related to. I mean, this is a national problem. Just like South Korea's development model is really, it's so weighted towards Seoul, which to me doesn't seem sustainable. Having half of your population live in one metropolitan area.
It's a depressed thing going there. I mean, but still compare with like Gyeongsang, Daegu, or Busan. Gwangju is very poor city. When I was in Seoul when I was in South Korea back 4 years ago, I had a chance to Daegu, Gwangju back to back. When I got out of the Daegu train station, first thing I saw was like a BMW dealer in front of a station. When I got out of Gwangju train station, I saw truck dealer, pickup truck dealer. Yeah, that sums me up. Seriously, that sums me up. One city has a BMW dealer at center of the city. The other city has a pickup truck dealer at the center of the city.
Yeah, I mean, kind of like a similar anecdote is that so my dad's from the Gyeongsang area. He born and raised in Daegu, and I visited the Daegu bus station. Well, actually, first I should probably say like the Gwangju Bus Station is kind of like an important like area in Gwangju. It's kind of their version of downtown. It only has like one floor. Mike visited it. There's a couple restaurants. The highlight is TGI Fridays. And the only like foreign bookstore. And it's like when I visited Daegu bus station, it blew my mind. This place has like four floors, multiple different buses. It's just way nicer. And like Daegu isn't exactly like that wealthy of a city anymore. Like it's also getting screwed over from sort of Seoul's consolidation.
And the fundamental problem with Gwangju is that they have no industrial base, unlike many other major cities.
Yeah, outside of the city, Jejudo is still quite agricultural, right? Because it's one of the few parts of South Korea where you can actually do agriculture due to the mountainous terrain elsewhere. I don't know. Yeah, it makes me think about. I mean, Japan and South Korea both have this problem too. Like we have declining birth rates, declining rural populations. Young people are moving to the cities. There's not really much significant immigration. It kind of makes you like think about what is going to be the economic model in 10 or 20 years. Like Japan, for example, is pursuing this kind of disturbing model where they're essentially going to be bringing in foreign migrant laborers on temporary contracts to do things like farm work and kind of menial service work, and then kick them out after a few years and refresh them. So they have no track to become citizens. So it's like, I don't know, it makes you wonder if there's just going to be this like sort of like quasi-apartheid labor system with like temporarily.
That's what's happening in South Korea now. I mean, when you go to farming village in South Korea or agrarian sector, you cannot raise rice without foreign labor.
Yeah, I've seen it. Yeah,
yeah.
In the countryside, it's
this is much worse than urban. I don't know. I mean, but that's maybe national. That's not limited to Gwangju. It's a very national question, but Gwangju suffered the most compared with, say, Gyeongsang-do, Gyeonggi-do, or Gangwon-do.
Capsule, if you wanted to say anything, kind of like the most important lessons we should take away from the Gwangju Uprising?
Okay. Once you study Gwangju, you come to understand that it was an international event. I mean, it was a result of a code of international politics back then. It's a strong repercussion throughout the region. So it's very important for the left keep tradition and legacy of Gwangju Uprising intact against liberal or conservative interpretation. So it should be part of Gwangju Uprising has each one place in global labor and left history.
Before you go, check out and share Gapsu's article on the Gwangju Uprising in the link above. as well as the Guangzhou Diary, which is now free online. Also, give some love to our boy Jack, who unfortunately couldn't be here today. I hope this episode inspired you as much as it did for me, and thanks for listening.